like to give you a brief outline of the development of the cinema industry and how this progressed to the building of theatres in the areas of Canterbury, Kew, Campbell, Baldwin and Surrey Hills, all in the leafy eastern suburbs of Melbourne. I've always been intrigued about what type of building best defines the 20th century. Many say the multi-level skyscraper is significant, but I suggest it is the picture palace or theatre. Such was the allure of the moving image. Nearly every suburb had one. The silent moving picture shows in the early 1900s, the first in Melbourne was in 1896, were very basic. They were termed the flicks, which evolved from the annoying flickering effect on the screen, which plagued many early silent movies, shown on rudimentary and less than perfectly adjusted equipment. At that time, there was no distributed electricity, very primitive projection equipment, and most venues were not designed for this type of entertainment. But the flicks had sparked the popularity and interest of the public. It was often referred to as the poor man's theatre, despite in those early days tickets being relatively expensive in relation to wages. Early film was illuminated by limelight, an ignition light source using carbide or coal gas with an oxygen combination to heat a block of lime to glow with a warm, bright yellowish light. Film at the time was of cellulose nitrate composition, a highly inflammable material. Even after limelight was superseded by carbon arc lamps, fires were still possible, posing an occupational hazard for projectionists, as well as a potential danger for audiences. Projection rooms or boxes were required to be built to ensure containment of any fires to the room itself. Film had to be stored or transported in solid metal film trunks. It was also a regulation that there be 2 projectionists as well as a fireman be in attendance when the cinema capacity was over 500 people. After the banning of nitrate films in the 1950s and the introduction of safety film, fires became a thing of the past. Silent movies were mostly black and white. Some were tinted and contained text on the screen, but would often have a score of musical sound effects to enhance the mood of the films. This was played live in the big city theatres by a small orchestra, or it had the magnificent Wurlitzer that could also mimic sound effects. But in the suburban theatres, it would be a piano, an organ, or a small trio, depending on the size of the cinema. So this sets the scene of early cinema. So, how did the theatres develop in the eastern suburbs? Firstly, most importantly, they were nearly always close to tram or train lines for public access. From about 1910 in the suburbs, early exhibitors used outdoor open airs. In the suburbs of Canterbury and Surrey Hills, screenings took place from 1912 in the suburbs' established gardens during the warmer months. Otherwise, flat floor halls were used. Most suburbs had community or town halls, and in the country areas, the Mechanics' Institute halls were often used. There are suburbs that are very lucky in that its early picture halls still exist in the streetscape, like this Surrey Hills Hall, used regularly in the late 1910s till the 1930s, even if it is now used for a different purpose. However, most have since been demolished. Early silent screenings were usually conducted by circuit exhibitors. Soon started building theatres or halls, primarily for cinema, with little decoration or refinement, often being just bare brick walls with the back wall painted to be the screen. as well as providing basic wooden seats. But the amenity of venues was about to improve, especially for residents in some of these eastern suburbs. In nearby Canterbury, the Marling Road streetscape was about to change with the two-level Canterbury Picture Theatre building and its accompanying shops, opening in November 1912. It was then refurbished 10 years later when Hoyts took control. That building, now an antique shop, is relatively intact internally still today, a rarity. Then, in 1914, Henry Holland, a director of the City Brick Company, with his access to cheap bricks, built his own picture theatre in Burke Road, near the junction. It was originally called Holland's, but later known as the Campbell Picture Theatre. The theatre had tip-up seats that locked together on slides, so that when one person wriggled, the vibration transmitted all down the row. Then they could be moved to make the cinema an all-purpose venue for dances and other events. It too was leased from Hoyts from 1921 for 10 years, but they closed it in 1927. Why? One less theatre for audience competition would best serve all interests. The Campbell theatre scene became very competitive as cinema patrons sought more comfortable venues. When it opened in 1921, the first Rivoli was built almost next door to Holland's. In fact, Henry was in double trouble because another theatre, originally called Our Theatre, but later renamed the Broadway, again in Burke Road, though closer to Campbell Station, opened the same year. The first Rivoli was built for an expanding suburban cinema entrepreneur, Robert McLeish. By this time, he controlled theatres in Northcote, Collingwood and Newmarket. This theatre had a towering Romanesque frontage with a lovely veranda. The interior was less impressive, though it did have better designed seating arrangements for optimal viewing. Apparently, front stall patrons bought their tickets in the main foyer, but were then obliged to leave and walk down an uncovered adjacent lane to a side entrance to re-enter again. The Broadway was also an impressive building on the outside. Built for a local syndicate headed by a Campbell auctioneer and real estate agent, a Mr. W.J.P. Davies, it struggled at the start and was soon sold to Mr. Frank Thring Sr. Frank Thring Sr.'s Amalgamated Theatres chain also commenced screening at the new Rialto Theatre in High Street, Kew, also built in 1921 for a local syndicate. That was later to become a Hoyts Theatre. It was advertised as Kew's Dainty Theatre and was situated at the crest of the hill. By the mid-1920s, the enriched storytelling in a length of at least 90 minutes and improved brilliance of image and focus meant that the film entertainment experience was closer to the standard we know today. Entrepreneur Frank Thring Sr., with his friend George Tallis, a director of J.C. Williamson's Theatres Limited, recognised that it was time theatre design matched this improvement. The films were now better quality than the theatres they were being shown in. F.W. Thring launched 3 Regent theatres, the name itself denoting their aristocratic pretensions. The link with affluence was spelled out in its publicity for the Anzac Day opening of the first of these flagship theatres, the Regent South Yarra, a worthy adjunct to the fashionable suburbs which surround it. The Regent Thornbury opened in August and the Regent Gardener on show day, the only Regent in the city or suburbs to open in the presence of the Governor of Victoria. By the late 1920s, 183 million cinema tickets were sold in 1 year, when the population of Australia was only 6.5 million. Film exhibition companies were getting bigger and stronger, and the Australian theatre conglomerates were growing as well. I'd like to talk to you a bit more about this Regent Theatre just over the border from Campbell in the locality of Gardener, because it puts what I want to say about the Baldwin Theatre in context. Sydney-based architect Charles Boehringer was brought in for this assignment, solving most of the problems inherent in the first Rivoli and others that preceded it. The facade wasn't overbearing, with the money spent on the interior. The lavatories were inside the building. The floor was strongly inclined, and near the stage the walls splayed inward to accentuate the screen and the high, wide and ornate illuminated proscenium, the frame around the screen. Stage boxes were back in favour, so that these theatres could claim to provide an experience similar to live theatre. Stage boxes, however, did create distorted sight lines for cinema goers. In this Regent, as in others, we see a new aesthetic, a suggestion of opulence, a charmed realm. The Balwyn Theatre, one of the two survivors in this story, was the expansionist plan of two partners, the Edmund brothers, who ran theatres in Preston, Newport and Williamstown. The plans were prepared in 1927, but for a number of reasons, the theatre did not open until January 1930. The interior design, when it opened, was similar to the Regent Gardener. The architect was constrained by his clients' wallets, and so the design and the finish in no way matched the Regent. Yet the partners advertised it as the finest theatre in the eastern suburbs. It had an orchestra and stage, and also advertised having a car park. In our archive room at Cats, we are fortunate to have the original orchestra conductor's lectern. I must mention an incredible incident that took place in 1947, like a scene from a cops and robbers film of its day, at the Baldwin Theatre, involving gelignite, gunshots, 4 arrests and a policeman injured. It was apparently a gang that had previously targeted other suburban theatre offices after closing. The Baldwin Theatre's survival today, though it did struggle through the late 1960s and early 70s with various exhibitors and name changes, was by becoming firstly a twin cinema and then a multiplex, when so many other theatre buildings have gone. It is another example of economics driving function and design. However, let's get back to the history. By 1929, a revolution in relation to film was about to change the film industry and bring about another attraction to increase the demand of suburban film goers, the Talkies. Sound synchronised with film. Some exhibitors initially thought it a fad, with early sound methods involving the use of records or discs amplified as the film was projected. The major debut talkie was The Jazz Singer, starring singer Al Johnson. However, even this rudimentary method required extensive modifications and expense in installing wiring and new equipment. Many of the theatres required internal remodelling, usually with a spruce up as well. Early adopters were the Hoyts Regents and the McLeish Theatres, as these owners had been to America in 1929 to see the attraction of talkies. Soon all the others followed suit, so strong was the attraction and novelty for the cinema-going public. However, economic hardship in the shape of the Great Depression was on the horizon of the early 1930s. Suburban box office receipts were plummeting due to unemployment. Already, the introduction of Talkies had put many theatre musicians out of work, combined with the general economic downturn, whereby by mid-1932, Victoria's unemployment was near 28%. Nevertheless, promoters adopted a defiant catch cry: "Forget the depression, the Talkies will cheer you up." By the end of 1930, throughout Australia, still only 67% of cinemas had sound, though most city and suburban venues had converted. Sound on film soon became the norm, though the acoustics of the auditoriums could be problematic. While a piano accompaniment or trio could plough their way through a score for a silent film in any hall, the addition of amplified speech, especially in a larger venue, could create an echo. Talkies were even introduced to the Surrey Hills Hall by various circuit theatre exhibitors from 1932. But it struggled to attract patrons from the larger, more comfortable venues, and by June 1937 the hall was up for auction, being sold by land agents including a local firm known as Dimmick and Long. Anyway, this was why many theatres had to modify their interiors to improve their acoustic properties. This was also the impetus for refurbishments at the larger Campbell theatres, the Broadway and the Rivoli in the early to mid-1930s. Architecture in the mid to late 1930s was also undergoing a rapid change. The profession was encompassing the influences of Art Deco modern style, with prominent theatre architects either creating new cinemas or changing the facades and interior decoration in this new style. For lovers of cinema design, the destruction of the Regal Theatre in Hartwell was a tragedy. It was on the V-shaped corner of Campbell Road and Toorak Road. Opened in 1937, and Robert McLeish had a hand in financing this building, it was to a design by Taylor, Sillot and Overend. This was Art Deco at its best. It had a unique ticket box design, a spacious roof garden, as well as a crying room, a new and popular feature in theatre design that enabled mums to attend morning or matinee sessions with young children, sitting behind a soundproof window so as not to cause disruption to other audience members. Some theatres even employed nannies, whilst mum enjoyed the movie in peace. The same team designed the second Rivoli, and both theatres should have been protected. The Regal for its pure Art Deco streamline aesthetic, and the new Camberwell Rivoli for its tricked up streamline version. Before talking about the new or second Rivoli, I will detail the Surrey Theatre in Union Road, Surrey Hills. It was built in 1939 by a small consortium of locals, headed by Laurie Rossiter, a builder who lived in Baldwin with a passion for cinema, and the real estate agents who assisted in the sale of the old Surrey Hall, William Roy Dimmick and Long, who already had the new theatre site before 1930. In fact, Mr. Rossiter had been exhibiting at the Surrey Hall from 1937. The new Surrey Theatre was opened by the then Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, a week before World War II was declared. Although a modest 700-seat one-level cinema, with the corner shop still the estate agency, it continued screening till 1960 as an independent picture theatre before becoming squash courts and now apartments. Interestingly, in 1946, Lolli Boys also took over the Plaza Theatre in Reservoir, but sold it in about 1950 to the same company who also took over the running of the Surrey. Knowing there could possibly be some easy and substantial money made, Lolli was targeted in a late-night robbery outside his then home in Horton Road, North Baldwin, of the cinema's takings in 1946. The pinnacle of suburban theatre construction, the second Rivoli in Upper Hawthorn, opened in 1940. Junction theatres were controlled by Robert McLeish Sr. and Jr., with Hoyt's money in there as well. Just as the Regent Gardener put the first Rivoli in the shade, so almost every design feature Scenic Gardener was improved upon. Externally, the Rivoli building can be admired from any position. The standard of the chromatic brickwork is superb. The angular and fully pitched roof eliminated the sound of rain in the theatre. Inside, the expansive Art Deco foyer allows easy access to all points. The scale of the lavatories was so good that Village made no changes to them in the 2000 makeover. Within the auditorium, every exit door was a double door with an airlock. No outside light visible under the door, so preserving total immersion in the movie experience. It also had a roof garden. The Rivoli embodies practicality with style. If this talk was a film, this is where I would stop, because the Rivoli was the climax. Superior design and quality workmanship. However, theatre construction continued in the surrounding suburbs, so we will continue. As the population expanded outward along Whitehorse Road, Hoyt saw the opportunity to capture a new audience in 1941. It was at the other end of the Balwyn shopping strip, to the independent Baldwin Theatre. Hoyt also realised that the day of Regent style was over. Economy in construction was the guiding principle. This was assisted by technical advances in moulding plaster sheeting to almost any shape and pattern, and by eliminating a true balcony by building what was now called stadium design. The architectural firm Cowper, Murphy and Appleford specialised in this style, and the Time Theatre was one of their best examples. The foyers now had an aesthetic that is now homely, with the fireplace and the table lamps. The theatre was fortunate to not be completely destroyed by fire in 1947, when the heating malfunctioned to cause a fire in the roof, destroying the screen during a cinema session. This caused its closure for several weeks. This new theatre for Canterbury was the last built for Hoyt's in its large suburban expansion program, as a replacement for the antiquated Canterbury Theatre. It opened 3 months after the Time in 1941. This theatre was another stadium design from a different architect. By now, wartime restrictions on materials put an end to any further expansion plans Hoyt's may have had. As it turned out, the Marling was Hoyt's last new screen for 30 years. World War II didn't really have a huge impact on audience numbers. In some suburbs, the demand increased, as the cinema was seen as an escape, as well as a way of visually seeing war footage and the news through the popular local and overseas newsreels. By the mid-1940s, another attraction for going to the pictures was that most films gracing the screen were now in colour. Though black and white films, usually the more B-grade pictures, with some exceptions, continued to be made into the 1950s. It also should be noted, though, that early colourised film had initially appeared in the 1930s. So in the 1940s and 50s, this area of the eastern suburbs had 9 theatres screening within a radius of 5 kilometres of Baldwin, all thriving as part of the cinema industry. So what was it like to go to the movies in the 1940s and 50s? If you were a kid, the Saturday matinee was the attraction. It filled the theatre during the day, but back then it was a rowdy affair. Managers and ushers dreaded the onslaught of boisterous, excited, and somewhat out of control behaviour of children on a Saturday afternoon. Firstly, a cartoon would be shown, then a serial, for example, Flash Gordon, before the main feature screened. This was usually a western that always had kids cheering or hollering at different parts of the film. It was a noisy affair. Food and lollies, the iconic Jaffas, would often become projectiles or roll down the aisle, forcing management to often stop the film until order was restored. Many of the cinemas attracted patronage through kids' clubs you could join, often with the manager giving a short presentation or led the singing for a club member's birthday. Cinemas also produced small cards advertising the coming features on them. They could be picked up at various milk bars and local businesses. However, for adults, the cinema experience was totally different. It was a sense of occasion, especially on those peak nights of Friday and Saturday. Bookings were often essential, especially if you wanted to impress by buying tickets to the lounge or the dress circle. Many residents had permanent bookings for the same seat each week. You got dressed up in your finest and would be greeted by the manager, ushers and usherettes in their beautiful suits with bow ties or uniforms, especially at the Hoyts theatres, where they provided comprehensive training. You will be guided to your seat. Wait for the lights to dim, with music playing. Often a theatre would still have an organist playing live. Then colourful slides advertising local businesses would appear on the big screen after the lush velvet curtains glided open. First the national anthem would play, by record at most, or a short film featuring the King or later Queen Elizabeth, whilst the soundtrack played. Everybody stood to attention. Then there were the forthcoming attractions, a newsreel with the familiar opening sound of the Kookaburra for Fox Movie Turn News, followed by a cartoon to put the audience into a laughing mood before the first feature. Then it was interval. At some theatres, there were Lolli Boys employed, resplendent in uniforms and trays, selling the Dixie ice creams and other chocolates or sweets. Many other theatres had either refreshment shops attached, or the nearby milk bar would employ Lolli Boys to sell in or outside the theatre at interval. Then back in for the main feature, till the end appeared on the screen, when everybody spilled out into the foyers to leave. However, by the late 1950s, the experience of going to the flicks was heavily impacted by the introduction of television. Cinema owners thought the new widescreen format of film screening, CinemaScope, introduced in the mid-50s, might be able to forestall the impact of the small household screen. And it did prove popular for a while. One city cinema, the Plaza in Collins Street, even introduced the even more spectacular image on the large curved screen called Cinerama, that involved 3 projectors screening the image simultaneously. This was between the years 1959 and 1963, but it proved too expensive to sustain with so few films made with that process. Next, the 70mm films that used wider film stock became the new immersive experience for screening films in the mid to late 1960s. Television caused many theatres to introduce restricted screenings to Thursdays, Fridays and Saturdays due to diminishing patronage. By 1966, the census showed that 80% of Australian households owned a TV set. The ability to afford cars had also changed the nature of leisure activities. Drive-ins became the new theatre experience. Drive-ins opened in the eastern suburbs, with the 2 closest being at Toorak in the disused quarry in late 1956 and the Burwood Skyline Drive-in, which was Melbourne's first, opened by Hoyts in early 1954. So the suburbs had an avalanche of theatre closures caused by economic necessity from 1959. Large cinemas were no longer viable as the audience stayed away. They were virtually empty except on Saturday nights. You went to the city if you wanted to see first release movies. Hoyts closed 15 suburban theatres in late 1959, including the Marling as well as the Regal in Hartwell. The Surrey Theatre closed in 1960, the Rialto Q closed in 1961, and the Time Theatre lasted till 1964. So when old theatres closed their doors, some were converted to other uses, or were demolished, as their land was now more valuable due to their prime locations. The Hoyts Broadway continued, after getting refurbished with better seats, but with a bland interior. This was a perfect match for a public only interested in image, sound, seating comfort and cleanliness. Hoyts also had the Hollywood product in new release films to sustain it till the Broadway's closure in 1979. The Rivoli re-emerged as a twin cinema on Boxing Day 1968 to reassert its premier place for the cinema-going public. Theatre owners needed a new business model, and that model was the multiplex. Hoyts opened Chadstone in 1987, and the cinema entered a new era. The eastern suburbs still have the Baldwin and the Rivoli, all now with multiplex screens, after their architecturally sympathetic expansions in the 2000s. To those of you who wish to see the last gem from a former era, a single screen cinema, the Astor Theatre in St Kilda, on the corner of Chapel Street and Dandenong Road, is still screening films.